Welcome to the City Club Forum. I'm Jim Lipscomb, president of the City Club. We're very pleased to welcome to our forum today Dr. Helen Caldicott, National President of Physicians for Social Responsibility. She will speak to us on the subject, the medical implications of nuclear war. Dr. Caldicott is a native of Australia, where she graduated from medical school and was in general practice. Following a research fellowship at Harvard Medical School in 1966 to 1968, she taught at the Children's Hospital Medical Center in Boston, and in 1977 accepted an appointment to the faculty of the Harvard Medical School. As a result of combining her professional career with an active role in founding the organization Physicians for Social Responsibility, Dr. Caldicott has received a number of honorary degrees and special citations, such as the Margaret Mead Environmental Award, the Thomas Merton Prize for Peace, and the Humanist of the Year Award from the Ethical Society of Boston. Her writings have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times and Science magazine. Dr. Caldicott, we are very much looking forward to this message of such special and timely importance.
Thank you very much. I come to you today as a very concerned physician. I represent 4,000 physicians in this country. I'm a member of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which met recently with physicians from 11 countries, including 17 Soviet physicians. We compared our data on the medical effects of nuclear war, and it totally agreed. We feel that nuclear war would create the final medical epidemic for which there will be no cure and for which we can do nothing. Our only vested interest is health and well-being of our patients, including all the politicians, all the citizens, and all the children in the world. We took the Hippocratic Oath, all of us, and therefore we can unite around the world to save the world. Nuclear war is not a political matter, it is not an economic matter, it is indeed a truly medical issue. The nuclear age began in the early 40s when Einstein became convinced that Hitler was building nuclear weapons, and he wrote a letter to Roosevelt advising this government to proceed with the development of such weapons. Thus began the Manhattan Project, which took 3 years to complete, and they made enough fissionable material to make just 3 bombs. The first one was exploded in the desert in 1945 in July, and it was called Trinity. There was some doubt and a probability that when that bomb exploded, the whole world would go critical. In other words, we'd all be engulfed in one single nuclear explosion. The physicists were worried about this matter, so they redid the calculations, and the probability remained the same, and indeed it was not small. However, they blew up the bomb anyway, and it remained confined. The next bomb was used on Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945 at 8:15 a.m. in the morning. The people in Hiroshima had been relatively spared from the war. They heard an air raid siren early in the morning, and then they heard the all clear and came out of their shelters. Then a single plane appeared overhead, and from that plane emerged one parachute. The people were pleased that the parachute emerged, thinking the plane had been shot down. Another parachute emerged adjacent to the first. There was a blinding flash, and tens of thousands of people in that instant were vaporized. That single bomb was equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT, and the largest planes in the Second World War carried only a payload of 4 bombs each. Children were seen running along the streets after that bomb was dropped, with their skin shedding off their bodies like veils. A mother was seen lying on the road with her back totally burnt, and a baby sucking at her nipple as she lay dying. A man was seen standing in a stunned state, holding his eyeball in the palm of his hand. And a man walked past a group of bushes and heard some funny noises and went in to investigate. And there were about 20 men who'd been in the Air Force, who'd been watching the plane, all in exactly the same state. You see, their eyes had melted. And they were so thirsty they couldn't drink because their lips were so swollen, so he fashioned a straw out of a piece of grass so that they could drink. Some people who escaped Hiroshima migrated to the only Christian center in Japan, thinking that would never be bombed by the United States of America, which indeed was Nagasaki, and they arrived 3 days later, just in time for the second bomb. Many Japanese say they can sort of understand the first bomb, but they say, why the second? After the war, Robert Oppenheimer was so distressed with what they'd done, he in fact designed the bombs and was the main brain behind the bombs. He talked to a group of physicists, his colleagues, and he said to them, for the first time, we have known sin. He was interviewed some 20 years later, a profoundly depressed human being, and they said, what do you think? This was in the 60s. He said, it's too late. And they said, what should have happened? And he said, it should have been stopped the day after Trinity. I would ask you all here, is it not amazing that we're still here eating this lunch today? Somehow we've fallen in love with these weapons. We've become hooked on them like opiates. They are totally biologically unacceptable, far worse than any bacteriological or chemical warfare. They explode with the heat of the sun. We have captured a power and a force and an energy which we are not capable of handling. Thus began the nuclear age. It has proceeded since then. Nuclear reactors were designed during the Manhattan Project to manufacture a new element called plutonium, named after Pluto, the god of the underworld, which in fact is the fuel for all nuclear weapons. It is a man-made element. It happens to be one of the most carcinogenic or cancer-causing materials that we know. As the collective guilt of the scientists was so great, they thought they could use atoms for peace, and Eisenhower gave the Atoms for Peace speech in the early 60s, and it was decided at that time to use nuclear reactors to generate electricity. But in fact, they're still bomb factories. It's been known for 15 years that civilian reactor-grade plutonium is fine for nuclear weapons. You just need a little bit more. Because of this, America and other countries have been exporting nuclear reactors throughout the Third World, and there are now about 30 countries who have the capability to generate plutonium and make nuclear weapons within a couple of months. Some of those countries have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Thus, we have the lateral proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Shah of Iran was building 20 nuclear reactors. When he left, he had the third largest air force in the world, and almost certainly within a few years would have made nuclear weapons. And if he'd resigned, or whatever he did, some years from now, this present war almost certainly would be being fought with nuclear weapons. During the 60s, Robert McNamara, then Secretary of Defense, estimated that if America had about 400 hydrogen bombs, now a hydrogen bomb is many times larger than an atomic bomb, the one that was used in Hiroshima, and they're cheap and easy to make. They can be made very big. Some of them that Russia has, their Russian bombs are bigger than American bombs because they're less accurate, are up to 20 megatons or 20 million tons of TNT. That is 4 times the size of all the bombs dropped during the Second World War. In fact, it would be relatively easy to make a 100 megaton bomb, which if exploded in space, increases the diameter of destruction and could in fact destroy 6 western states of the United States of America with just one bomb. McNamara estimated that if America had about 400 of these weapons, that would be sufficient to kill 1/3 of the Russian people and destroy 2/3 of their industry, and that would be a sufficient deterrent to prevent the Russians doing what America didn't want them to do. I thought about that statement the other day as a physician, and I thought, who has talked like that in recent history? Hitler. Only he talked about killing all the Jews in Europe. 1/3 of the Russian people is 100 million human beings. I was as blasé as anyone else and as psychically numb till I realized how we have accepted these facts. At that stage, however, the Air Force had all the weapons, and there is a traditional rivalry between the forces in the military, as you well know if you've been in the military, and the Army and Navy were jealous and they wanted some bombs too. So it was decided to develop a triad of nuclear weapons. You've heard that word, triad. As I go through these words, remember that doctors use words to confuse patients. We have our own special language. The Pentagon uses words to confuse the public. They have their special language. It's easy to understand if you dissect it. It's imperative that we do. At that time, it was decided also to nuclearize all forms of conventional weapons. Do you know that men go into battle carrying 18-inch howitzers on their shoulders with nuclear weapons in them? The torpedoes are nuclearized, the landmines, the surface-to-surface missiles, surface-to-air missiles. There are also conventional weapons, but all forms are nuclearized. When the Army went into Lebanon in 1957, they took nuclear weapons with them. It is well known that one or two tactical nuclear weapons could initiate a nuclear war. Now, what is the difference between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons? Strategic are those that are on missiles and go from continent to continent. Tactical are those that are carried into battle or dropped from aeroplanes. They're exactly the same. They're just put in different delivery systems. That's all. Now, how many weapons does America have today? How many hydrogen bombs? Remember, 400 was enough to kill 1/3 of the Russian people. As I talk, remember, there are only 5,000 worthwhile targets. Worthwhile is a Pentagon word. In either Russia or America, 5,000. Today, America has some 30 to 35,000 hydrogen bombs. They build or recycle 3 to 10 new hydrogen bombs each day. America has enough bombs to overkill, which is a peculiar Pentagon word, every Russian individual, human being, some 40 times. And Russia has 20,000 hydrogen bombs, which I said are bigger than American bombs because they're less accurate. And if you want to hit Cleveland and you land 2 miles away, you've got to have a bigger bomb to get Cleveland. They have enough to overkill every one of you people some 20 times. There are enough bombs in both superpowers to overkill every person on Earth about 12 to 16 times. Now I've lost my train of thought. There are enough bombs on one Trident submarine, in fact, to destroy every major city in the Northern Hemisphere, and America is building 11 Trident submarines. Who makes the hydrogen bombs? General Electric make the trigger for the hydrogen bomb. Bendix washing machine make the polystyrene foam that goes around the fusion trigger, and Union Carbide make the external capsule. I've just mentioned a few of the corporations involved in making the weapons. Now, some people often say, well, Russia's ahead. When I've just laid out that data, is it not logical to ask medically, what do you mean ahead or behind? But let's go into that, okay, and examine who is ahead and what it actually means if we want to get into this sort of 5-year-old little boy competition game, the sort of games I used to play with my brother when I was 5 over a piece of cake. America has 9,200 strategic warheads. Russia has 6,000. America has 20 to 25,000 tactical nuclear warheads. Russia has 15,000. America has 13 aircraft carriers, manned to the hilt. Russia has 2. America has 41 submarines. Russia has 93, half of which are diesel, very noisy and extremely vulnerable. America has 20 submarines on, these are submarines that carry ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons. America has 20 submarines on call at any one time. Russia has 10 on call at any one time because their technology is far behind this country. If you've ever visited Russia, they're poor. Even the concrete on the outside of their nuclear reactor is cracking. They're in bad shape, technologically speaking. Of the total weapons in the submarines, ballistic missiles that can hit the Soviet Union and the United States, the US has 6,000 nuclear weapons and Russia has 1,500, of which America keeps 3,000 ballistic missiles off the coast of the USSR all the time, and there are 240 warheads off the US coast at any one time. That's a lot, of course, you know. You can kill an awful lot of people in America with 240 warheads. People say Russia's expansionist, and I looked up the data the other day for actual expansionism. America has 200 major military bases in 45 nations in the world. It has 22 major ports where submarines, nuclear submarines, and huge ship stock. Russia has no major bases in no countries and no major ports. Anyway, those arguments are silly. Do you know what happens? I go to a radio station and I lay out the medical consequences of thermonuclear war, and I will do that in a minute, and people come back and say, what about the Russians? What about Afghanistan? As if the data I've just given them goes straight over their heads, like that, like streamlining. It hasn't even penetrated their hypothalamus so they can feel what I've said. I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned about every individual in the world. I'm not concerned about competition, for it is that way of thinking that will destroy us all. Let's break it down to a medical model. We have a terminally ill planet, that it is infected with lethal microbes, which are these weapons, which are metastasizing rapidly like a cancer. Now, the way you treat a terminally ill patient in the ICU is you delicately balance the electrolytes, you stabilize the cardiac function, you eradicate the infecting organism, you give them specialized care 24 hours a day, and occasionally that patient survives. That's the state of our planet, which carries maybe the only life in the whole universe. Now, what would a nuclear war mean? They talk about a limited nuclear war now. A limited nuclear war might mean a lot of missiles from Russia hitting the Minutemen in America. They're the missiles. How many Americans would that kill from the fallout? Some 20 to 50 million Americans. A limited nuclear war, you know, even if Russia did that, half the American missiles and bombs are in submarines, 25% are in the airplanes, and only 25% of the weapons are in the missiles on the ground. So there are still enough to kill every Russian person, lots of times, even if they knocked out the Minutemen silos here. The National Academy of Sciences did a study in 1975 and estimated if the superpowers used 10% of the arsenals of their nuclear weapons, it could destroy, by the release of nitrous oxides, 80% of the ozone in the northern hemisphere and 30 to 40% in the southern hemisphere. It is thought by some that if only 20% of the ozone is destroyed worldwide, it could blind every organism on Earth from the background radiation from the sun getting in, even the insects. That means no pollination of crops, no birds to eat the insects, no mammals, no humans. That's virtually the death of the ecosphere. That's only 10% of the bombs. Let me proceed. What happens in a full-scale nuclear war? A nuclear war will take about 20 minutes to half an hour to complete bilaterally. Once the button is pressed, the weapons go out into space, re-enter the Earth's atmosphere at 20 times the speed of sound, and land fairly accurately on target. Meanwhile, a satellite from the other country and the radar detects the attack, and the button's pressed on the other side. Bilaterally, about half an hour. Now, what's the targeting strategy? According to the Department of Civil Defense here, every town and city with a population of 25,000 people or more is targeted with a nuclear weapon. In fact, there are so many, there are probably 65 hydrogen bombs targeted on New York City alone. The nuclear reactors are targeted, as there is as much radiation in each 1,000 megawatt reactor as that released by the explosion of 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. A single 1 megaton bomb dropping on a 1,000 megawatt reactor would contaminate for some thousands of years an area the size of West Germany. That aggravates the fallout. The airports are targeted, the major industries and the oil refineries. The same targeting strategy holds true for the Soviet Union, probably China, certainly Europe and England. What happens if a 20 megaton bomb should drop on Cleveland? It would form a crater 1.5 miles wide and 300 feet deep, so that everything within that volume would be converted to radioactive fallout. All people up to a radius of 6 miles from the center would be vaporized, turned into gas, and most buildings. All people up to a radius of 20 miles would be either lethally injured or dead. If you were looking at the blast, just looking 40 miles away, you'd be instantly blinded as a flash burnt the retina or the back of the eye. It would form by its immense heat a firestorm of 3,000 square miles in area, so everything would spontaneously ignite, even burning concrete and sometimes steel. And if you were in a fallout shelter, you would not survive because the fire would use up all the oxygen and you'd be asphyxiated. Now that's most population centers in the United States. What would happen if you lived in a rural area? I'm describing now an article from the New England Journal of Medicine in 1962. You would have to be awake, not asleep. You would have to be listening to the radio. And do you know, sometimes you hear, ooh, that was the emergency signal. Then they would probably say, run very fast to the nearest shelter. You have 20 minutes. Remember, you won't probably have time to collect your family, your children, those you love. Now, medically, when you're in the shelter, you cannot re-emerge for 2 weeks because the fallout is so intensely radioactive, you would die. When you come out, this is what you will see. There will be millions of corpses, and the bacteria multiply in the dead bodies and mutate in the radioactive environment to become more lethal. The immune mechanism in our bodies that fights infection is depleted by radiation, so all the diseases we medically now control, polio, typhoid, plague, dysentery, will be epidemic in proportions. What about the doctors? Most hospitals, or most all, will be destroyed. Most doctors will be dead. Those who are alive will have no drugs. Except last year, the Boston Globe reported that President Carter was stockpiling huge quantities of opium just in case there's a nuclear war. I suppose we'd have to know where it was, and if we had it, we could inject it into the dying people to give them some peace, as euthanasia. It is thought that so much ozone will be destroyed that if you stayed in the sun for 3 minutes, you'd develop third-degree sunburn, which is lethal, and be blinded, so you'd have to live underground. There would be nobody to help. In Hiroshima, there were people to come and help. In this instance, civilization as we know it will be totally destroyed. All the music, the architecture, the literature, the art, gone. People will die of starvation. They'll die of a synergistic combination of starvation, acute radiation illness, infection, sunburn, blindness, and grief. It would be the grief that would kill me. And it's predicted that in 30 days after such an attack, 90% of Americans will be dead. What about the other countries? Do you know that 92% of the people in the world don't live in either of the superpowers and don't really care much about the silly arguments that they have about who's better and who's stronger? They want to live. But you see, they probably will be taken as well. We may be the only life in the whole universe, and yet we seem to be proceeding towards our annihilation, practicing what we call psychic numbing. Are we not? When animals are in a cage threatened with a life-threatening situation, you find that they do something quite strange. They go away and practice displacement activity, doing something totally irrelevant to their situation. Are we not all doing that? And by doing that, are we not innately suicidal? If I have a patient who enters my office saying they're thinking of ending it all, I ask them how. They will usually tell me, and I immediately hospitalize them. How do we break through this psychic numbing? I think we tell people the medical message. How have we gotten to this situation? Well, the psychiatrists at the International Physicians Meeting for the Prevention of Nuclear War from around the world got together and psychoanalyzed our present dynamic with the Russians. We think it is this: the incredible innate fear that we all have subliminally of living in the nuclear age, remembering when we used to practice war drills, getting under our desk as children, putting bits of paper on our heads to hide from the nuclear bomb, having nightmares about nuclear war, which come up periodically every time the international situation worsens, although we know more bombs are being built. That fear is profound. And if you really take it on frontally, you enter a grieving situation. The stages of grief are shock and disbelief. The next stage is profound depression. It's worse than your own death. Do we all not love this planet? Look at a rose. Look at the magnolias blooming. Look at a baby. Then you follow by profound anger and then acceptance. We would do anything than confront those painful feelings. So what do? Instead of taking on our own fear and discomfort, actually it's not applicable to be psychologically comfortable today. It's totally inappropriate. We project it onto someone else. And at the moment, it's the Russians. A few years ago, it was the Chinese. I'm sure if the Martians invaded, everyone would unite and would all hate the Martians. But this is the dynamic, and the fear is so profound, and the hatred that goes with it so profound, that the Russians become inanimate objects. And when they're inanimate objects in our minds, we can easily kill all of them with the press of the button. And when we enter that psychological dynamic, we lose our own humanity. Is that not what has happened to us all? We are all brothers and sisters on a tiny, tiny little planet in a huge universe. We are mortal, we are human, capable of the most profound emotions. Where is our passion? What has happened to our emotions? It is science that it has surgically obliterated emotion from our lives. Why? If you inject emotion into your experiment, you bias the data. If I'm emotional with my dying patient, I don't treat them objectively. But to be dispassionate about our annihilation is not mentally normal. What is the probability of this war occurring? The Joint Chiefs of Staff estimated in 1975 before a Senate committee that there was a 50-50 chance of a nuclear war by 1985. President Reagan's advisors have been writing articles recently saying it is possible to fight and win a nuclear war. You know that, don't you? You've been reading it. Many people now wonder if we'll reach the year 1990. I myself feel we'll be lucky to survive the next 4 years. We will, though, if we do something. Everyone can be depressed. You can only let yourself be depressed if you have done every single thing you can to stop this. Every waking minute. Nothing else has any significance. Doesn't matter if you make money, have a good job, write a good paper, get good food to eat, look after your children, or have a good marriage relationship. Nothing else matters if we are about to destroy this planet. And it's a wonderful feeling to do something about it. You have to feel uncomfortable. You must change totally the priorities in your life. It's a truly religious commitment. For this generation has more responsibility vested in it at this time than any other generation has ever had. Because soon the technological developments in the arms race will be so profound that the weapons will be unverifiable and we will not be able to have any more arms control SALT talks, and it will be too late. Therefore, we must become passionate. Each one of us must take symbolically the world on our shoulders like Atlas, as adults who represent our children, and take total responsibility. We can blame no one else but ourselves. We pay our taxes. This is our planet. Our children, one of the main reasons Harvard psychiatrists have found they're taking drugs and drinking alcohol is because they feel they have no future. What have we done? What have we done to our children? Thank you.
I will make some announcements. Thank you, Dr. Caldicott. Today at the City Club, we're listening to Dr. Helen Caldicott of Boston on the subject, the medical implications of nuclear war. In just a moment, we'll turn to our traditional question period, but first some announcements. Right now, we're in the midst of our annual membership drive, this year during April and May. Today, I am pleased to report that in just the first week of our campaign, we have received 72 new members. and we've really only started. For those of you who are not yet members of the City Club, you may join now for just $25, which will cover your dues from now till the end of our membership year, November 30. Why not call our office at 621-0082 for more information, or stop in today at 320 Superior Avenue and let us sign you up. Just $25 for membership in the City Club. Today, as always, we have students with us from area high schools who are participating in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Board of Education and with the support of Sohio. Students with us now are from the following high schools: Berea, Lakewood, James Ford Rhodes, John Adams, St. Ignatius, St. Augustine Academy, Brattonall, Laurel, Charles F. Brush, John Hay, Parma, West Technical. Will they please stand to receive our welcome? Thank you. They will be meeting with Dr. Caldicott for their own seminar right after our forum here. Next week for our forum, we will present a debate on President Reagan's economic program. Two economic professors from Cleveland State University. It will be Dr. John Burke versus Dr. Leonard Martin. Make your reservations early for this special debate. Now for our questions for Dr. Caldicott. We have two microphones, one in the front with Alan Davis, one in the rear with Ken Kovach. Raise your hand to be recognized. First question, please.
Dr. Caldicott, you presented so well the medical implications and concerns and enjoined us to become more involved and active in this. But to do that, I think we must present some type of program. And it would have to be not unilateral, but would have to extend to all places where the potential for nuclear war could emanate. And what would you propose as a way of operating, what we should say should be done?
The main problem is the superpowers. The proliferation in third world countries is dependent upon what the superpowers have done and are doing. 12 years ago, the superpowers signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, encouraging third world countries to sign it too so they wouldn't make bombs. The superpowers promised at that time to stop making bombs and start disarming 12 years ago. So you can't tell a third world country not to make bombs when the superpowers have them. That's very arrogant. What about the superpowers? The superpowers have signed 17 agreements over the last years, none of which have been violated, about nuclear weapons. The last agreement that was worked out over 7 years of hard, tough negotiation was SALT II, which in fact didn't stop the arms race but leveled it off at a situation of what they call parity. We're only, remember, talking about strategic weapons. Remember the tactical ones I left out. They've left out. It's not dependent upon trust. Each side can adequately verify what the other side has. The fact is that America apparently is not satisfied with parity, which exists for the first time. It still wants superiority. Obviously, in that position, neither side will agree to stop the arms race. SALT II, I believe, is dead. What a lot of people are proposing now is a bilateral freeze in production, development, and deployment of any more new nuclear warheads, followed then by progressive disarmament. What about the Russians, everyone would say. I visited the Soviet Union 18 months ago with some senior American people, including a chief advisor to Paul Warneke during SALT II, and we proposed this freeze. At that time, SALT II was dying. We were there when Frank Church discovered the so-called Soviet Brigade in Cuba, which later the CIA said they'd known about since 1962. But the Russians were literally tearing their hair out, saying, how can we get America to ratify SALT II? And we presented to them the freeze. Now, they don't like to change. They're very rigid. Once they've worked something out, they want that. That's their system. And we argued back and forth. They made phone calls. We drank vodka. We made them really mad. And eventually they said, well, they'd vote for that with both hands. That's including the two diplomats who negotiated SALT II. What's happening here is that 14 towns in Vermont a few weeks ago voted for the freeze. the Massachusetts State Senate is about to vote for the freeze. That would stop the arms race. It would obviate MX, Trident, cruise missile, MIRVing the SS-20s in Russia, the whole thing. If it's not stopped now, the cruise missiles about to be deployed in Europe are strategic weapons. They bypass the SALT II agreement. They're unverifiable by satellite because they're so tiny. Once they're deployed, that'll be the end of any form of arms control, because it'll have to be based on trust, and obviously trust does not exist between the superpowers. There are ways to go. What can people do? Well, you can all join Physicians for Social Responsibility, even though you're not a physician. And we need money. I need $500,000 to $1 million at the moment. I think the physicians have the key. It's a little key at the moment, but it soon will be a big key. You know, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal recently about us and the medical effects of nuclear war. It has turned round the most arch-conservative people because the medical message is absolutely undeniable. So you can join us, and I've got a telephone number here if you all want it. The telephone number to call is 932-3098. That's Stephen Crane at Physicians for Social Responsibility. The other thing you can do is join the Women's Party for Survival. Now, that's a real political party, and I started it. I'm not an American, I'm an Australian, but I want the world to survive. And being a mother and having delivered 3 babies, I know that the instinct to protect those children is stronger than the instinct to protect my own life. And I think if we can mobilize that instinct in women and all the men who care, and that's the nurturing, loving instinct, we can save this planet. And I mean millions of women and millions of men. Because we're in the grip now of a death-producing instinct, a necrophiliac instinct, which if it goes on with the sort of competition, macho, egocentric killing instinct, will certainly obliterate all of us. So if you'd like to join the Women's Party, you call this number, 241-7859, 241-7859. We're having a Mother's Day march in Washington, D.C. on May the 10th. Why? Mother's Day was founded by a woman called Julia Ward Howes during the Franco-Prussian Wars as a day of peace. We're all going to wear our Sunday best. We're going to have lots of babies, and if you don't have a baby, borrow one. And we march with we march with American flags to the White House, where I will address the crowd about the medical effects of nuclear war, and Dr. Benjamin Spock will talk about our babies in the future. Randall Forsberg, who knows a lot about the arms race, will speak. The next day, you make appointments right now with your legislators. We lobby in the Senate and Congress, and we put our baby on the desk of the senator. We may have to change the diaper. And we say, Senator, why aren't you representing the life of this child? And that's what it's all about. The symbol of what we represent is a baby. There are not communist babies or capitalist babies. They're all babies. And you know, this dynamic of hating someone else has existed ever since we've been on Earth. It's always produced wars. And war now, biologically, is no longer an option. The only weapon we can use is this, the larynx.
Caldicott, to what extent do you think that there are erudite and professionally trained and sensitive people such as yourself who could give the same kind of speech and perhaps are giving the same kind of speech today within the Soviet Union?
Well, I can speak from my own experience. At that conference 3 weeks ago in Washington with the physicians, 17 physicians came, including Leonard Brezhnev's cardiologist, who is in the Presidium, and also a man called Georgy Arbatov, who is very senior and just under Brezhnev. He's his chief advisor on America. We showed a film called The War Game, which was made by the BBC about a nuclear weapon dropping on London about 20 years ago and was never shown by the BBC. It's a horrifying, realistically medical film. And he said that he would take that back and show it on Russian television. We wrote a letter to President Carter and Chairman Brezhnev a year ago warning them of the medical consequences of nuclear war. And that letter was published on the front page of Pravda. I had to pay $20,000 to get a page in the New York Times to publish it. No one else would publish it. As we spoke to the senior Soviet officials when we were there, they were very enthusiastic about nuclear power. It was like talking to Metropolitan Edison or the NRC. But uniformly, as we spoke about nuclear war, they over and again told us they lost 20 million people in the Second World War. 20 million people. Every family lost a member. And as I walked around Moscow, there were brides all over the streets. And I said, what are these brides doing? And they said the tradition is when a woman marries, she takes her flowers and places it on the peace memorial so the children will never know war. The doctors told us that the children are taught in schools about nuclear war, and most Russians remember that war anyway, the other war, but they understand what nuclear war would mean. We went to a cemetery in Leningrad. You remember it was under siege for 3 years by the Nazis, probably the most beautiful city in the world. And it was a huge cemetery with mass graves with 500,000 people buried there, aunts and grandmothers, etc., who died of starvation, graves as big as this room. And there was a long avenue down between the graves, and at the end of the avenue was a big statue of Mother Russia holding an olive branch. And it was bitterly cold and raining. And as we walked down, there were the sounds of Bach's double violin concerto coming through the atmosphere. And I said to my colleague, who is in Washington, as I walked down with him, he said, you know, after the next war, if anyone remains alive and they come back here, they'll say they didn't learn.
Do you realize that underlying issues in this so-called crisis that they just didn't develop with the atomic bomb, but they goes back some 65 years when the Communist Party was founded? And do you realize in 1956, when Khrushchev explained the millions and millions and millions of people that Stalin murdered, and how do you expect us then to give up our philosophy of freedom in order to accomplish this? The issue is freedom against communism, which is underlying this, and you didn't mention it today. Mm-hmm. Do you understand that that is the issue that people are willing to lay their lives down for?
Well, I can't really understand the question because are you implying that Russia would invade this country? Invade the United States? No, I'm asking you, are you implying that Russia could invade the United States of America?
Yes.
You are. Well, that's physically and militarily an impossibility because America is surrounded, well, on one side there's Canada, that's really part of the US. On the bottom there's Mexico, which is friendly. Canadians don't like saying that, but they are. On the other two sides are two oceans. It is, talk to military men in the Pentagon, I have. It is militarily impossible to invade this country. Certainly they can kill everybody in this country, but if they do, you see, they'll all probably die from the fallout. Dead, yeah. You see, what I'm trying to do is get through the medical message. I'm concerned about your life. I am very frightened as a physician that we are all going to fry. And I love you, and I love your children, and I love all the people in this country. What's more, I love all the people on the planet. Are we going to behave as we always have as children? But there's always an excuse to have a war. What we have to understand for the first time is that we can't fight. Einstein said it best. He said, the splitting of the atom has changed everything save man's mode of thinking. Thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe.
Dr. Caldicott, thank you for coming here. Have you calculated the effect on our water supply, that is Lake Erie, of detonating a large hydrogen bomb in the water, that is the tidal wave or the contamination?
Well, no. The military have pictures of 20 megaton bombs blowing up in the water, and there are huge battleships at the periphery of the blast. and they're just minuscule, like little tiny boats in a bathtub, compared to this huge column of water that goes up, and then the tidal wave that comes over just totally turns ships upside down and sinks them. So I would presume that it would be a very large wave that would engulf Cleveland as well. But, you know, I suppose it doesn't matter because everyone will be dead anyway.
Dr. Caldicott, over here. If we concede everything that you said so eloquently today, most Americans would still argue, I believe, feel very fervently, that the major risk of a nuclear holocaust would come from a hijacker or some other terrorist, or maybe from some small country settling a border war such as Iran and Iraq, or finally, and most importantly, from Russia itself. If you'll concede me that, if you'll give me that, does it not follow that you're addressing us here today is really, although a very sincere kind of effort, really nothing more than an academic exercise which is on the fringes of the main issue? And do you do things like hold rallies on Red Square, or pin diapers on babies in front of the Kremlin, and things of that nature?
Well, I think I've just explained to you that my impression and that of many others, and certainly speaking with the Soviet physicians, is one of extreme and profound concern. Leonid Brezhnev, a physician, said to us recently, you know, as we talked about the medical effects, this data. And I don't know if you really have understood what I've said. Leonid Brezhnev's cardiologist said to us, as if a light suddenly went into his head, he said, you know, he said, the politicians are our patients. That's... Well, I'd have to say in answer to that, and I don't want to get into this sort of thing, that America built the first atomic bombs and used the only atomic bombs ever used on civilian populations. Then 4 years later, Russia did build atomic bombs. Then America built the first hydrogen bomb, then Russia did. America built the first nuclear-powered submarines, then Russia did. America MIRVed the first missiles, then Russia did. It's a sort of childish, never-ending chase the leader, you see. And it's fun. The scientists are having a ball. I spoke to a leading computer professor in MIT recently who designed the computers that put the men on the moon and probably helped the space shuttle computers. Incidentally, 90% of the functions of the space shuttle are military. And I said, Joe, why do these men make these weapons of incredible mass destruction? Great brilliance. Over half the scientists in this country are involved in the military-industrial complex. And he said, do you know why? It's incredible fun. You have an insoluble problem how to put 10 hydrogen bombs on one missile, each with a computer in its nose, so they each go off and land independently on a separate city. And it's insoluble, and you solve it. Then you go home at night and make sure the kids have cleaned their teeth and had a good meal and make love to the wife, I guess, and get up the next morning and solve another insoluble problem. In other words, the scientists, both here and in the Soviet Union, both are as mad as each other, and both are creating our global gas oven, and gravity is our barbed wire. And someone has to confront the scientists and say, what on earth do you think you're doing? Where is your morality and love for your children? I treat these people when they're sick or they're dying children, because my specialty is cystic fibrosis, and all my patients die, often in childhood. I see these men in their grief, and they're loving, frightened, caring human beings, as are the Russian people. All of us are. And you see, we have to stop hating each other. It's an easy thing to do to project out hatred onto someone else. If you have a marriage and it's not working, you don't fix a marriage by standing off and hating each other and not talking. That doesn't work. Nor do you fix a marriage that's not working by blowing it up with TNT. The only way to fix a marriage is go and say, hon, what's the matter? What have I done? You have made me so mad. Well, what is it? Well, you've done bang, 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 bang. Well, can I capitulate here and maybe you'll capitulate there? We know how to resolve conflict. There are many psychological ways of resolving conflict. The superpowers are just a sort of an analogy of a marriage, but on a massive scale. It's mass psychology instead of individual psychology. We know in our mature ways how to resolve conflict. For the first time since we've been on the planet, we must grow up and stop behaving like children and become adults. And do you know who taught us to do that? Jesus. You don't believe in Jesus that he was the Son of God. You do as he did. And if you try and do what he did, it's the most difficult thing you'll ever set out to do. The other thing is that, you know, doing this work is therapeutic. It makes you feel better. It's like if you have a pain in your joint, if you take aspirin, it works. It takes the pain away. But Kubler-Ross, Dr. Kubler-Ross, have studied dying patients, and I see people die. Do you know the people who find it hardest to die and cling on tenaciously to a cancer-riddled body are those people who've never loved and given, who've been selfish and greedy. The people who die with grace and dignity, at peace with themselves, are those people who've given and loved. It's a wonderful feeling. True happiness comes not from making yourself feel better, but making others feel better and working for each other.
But please, Dr. Caldicott, do not exclude those of us who sincerely believe that this is an intensely selfish issue and who are not in a posture of sacrificing themselves to others over the issue. You introduced that new avenue at the last there and forced me off my train of thought. I sincerely appreciate what, in my opinion, is a clear statement of our global priority. That's as clearly as I can put my reaction to your talk today. And I think it may be an important time for us to revert back to this usually unnecessary, I think, in this group, qualification, in my opinion. But I think this is an area where we really all are starting to get emotional and angry and should, and therefore it might be a time for all of us, even you, if I may presume, to qualify in your opinion. Because we're dealing with areas in which sincere people do believe it's an issue of freedom and do believe that our six guns are our only protection against that freedom. I think that we have a frontier ethic or syndrome that I don't completely understand, but that is the emotional component that many of us here truly do believe in. And it's an issue against atheism and an attempt to take our freedom away from us, and the only thing standing against that is our six guns, so to speak. The question really is, how can we best deal with this emotional subject that I think makes most of us feel that this problem is not real, that it will go away?
Well, I think it was fine to think like that. It was okay to think like that before we got these weapons. The more bombs a nation had, the better defended and protected and the more secure the nation was, because they could literally obliterate their enemy and build themselves up from the rubble. Do you understand what I've said about these bombs? You see, your argument is just not medically applicable. You see that? Because if there's a war, we'll all die together in half an hour. All these justifications, all that's coming out to me now are justifications to have a nuclear war. And George Kennan, who is a very sober, very senior diplomat, highly respected in this country, who's lived in the Soviet Union for years, he says, he gets quite emotional, and for a diplomat, that's something. He says, for the love of God, of your children and of the civilization to which you belong, cease this madness. You have a duty not just to the generation of the present. You have a duty to civilizations past, which you threaten to render meaningless, and to its future, which you threaten to render non-existent. You are mortal men. You are capable of error. You have no right to hold in your hands. There is no one wise enough and strong enough to hold in his hands destructive powers sufficient to put an end to civilized life on a great portion of our planet. No one should wish to hold such powers. Thrust them from you. the risks you might thereby assume are not greater, could not be greater, than those which you are now incurring for us all. There is no risk greater than killing every person on the planet. No risk greater. That's the sort of thing that has to penetrate our souls. Our souls.
Dr. Caldicott, I, for one, want to thank you for making such a very important... Dr. Caldicott, I, for one, want to thank you for making such a very great contribution to our very survival. On the way in here, I overheard a comment, and this person said, I don't think it's going to be a very sexy subject. I believe that's a fair statement. It wasn't a sexy subject. But my question is, what hope do you have for the reconvening of the Pugwash conference?
I think the Pugwash has achieved nothing. It hasn't achieved any disarmament. The hope I have is for the doctors of the world to unite around the world as a sort of umbrella, a medical umbrella instead of a nuclear umbrella. And we will save the planet, because it is medically contraindicated to have a nuclear war. And the ultimate in preventive medicine is to eliminate rapidly every single one of these weapons from the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Caldicott, for a message that I'm sure will remain with all of us for many months and I hope years to come. Our speaker today at the City Club Forum has been Dr. Helen Caldicott, National President of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Her subject has been the medical implications of nuclear war. We thank all of you for being with us today. The City Club Forum is adjourned.